Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. We're going to recreate the intro video you just saw, so it's going to be a bit of pCustom type action. If you've never worked with pCustom before, don't worry, but if you do want to know a bit more about it, do check out my Unleash the Power of Particles tutorial. It's quite an old one, but it's still relevant. I will touch upon the basic concepts in this video though, so it's not absolutely needed, but if you're really interested, I do recommend that. So we're here in Davinci Resolve, but of course you could do this in Fusion standalone as well. In fact, that is what I would normally do, but I know most folks use it within Resolve. So there we go. Having said that, we're going to start with a Fusion composition and we'll drag that into the edit timeline. And we'll drag it out a bit just to make it a bit longer. You don't need to be overly precise about it. There we go. So what are we going to do first? So we want to create a little triangle first, or whatever shape. But in the example I used a triangle, and the triangle would form the petal of the flower. As of Fusion 16, I believe you've got these shape nodes. But if you don't have Fusion 16, if for instance you're still in Fusion 9 or Davinci Resolve 15 or whatever, you can just use any type of image, and I'll show that later on as well. But in any case, let's just start by doing the n-gon and pipe that into an S-render. And sorry, I'm a bit fat-fingered because I managed to cut myself in my finger, so I've got a bit of a bandage on there. So let's show that in here. So we've got this, this nice shape in here. So the first thing I want to do is make this a bit smaller. Oops, that's in here. I'll untick the auto resolution and I'll set it to 200 by 200. Right, so then we get this. Next one up, back to the n-gon and set this to 3 sides. Then we get our triangle. Now I want to move it around by, not minus 90, by 90 degrees. And there we are. Now, one thing is very, very important. In fact, it's pun intended, it's pivotal to move this down. And we can then increase the width, and that's now the height because of course it was turned by 90 degrees, so that basically the point of this is sort of in the middle of this square. The reason is that the pivot point of a particle is sort of a bitmap serving as a particle. You'll see that in a moment. The pivot point is right in the middle, right? So if you would have the triangle going from up to down, then all the rotations would work from the middle of the triangle, and I don't want that. I want it to be rotated around the top, right? So that it is a petal. All right, so we've got this now. Let's now start with our particle emitter and then followed by particle render, of course. So let's move that to the side, and in the P emitter, we're going to change a few things. Now, first of all, the number we're emitting. I'll put in an expression, but of course you can keyframe it as well. If time equals 0, so at the start of the composition, then emit the number of particles, and otherwise 0. Now, the number of particles I want 6 petals per flower. So, and I want to have 100 flowers, so 100 times 6, right? I need 600 particles. So 600, and otherwise 0. There we go. Lifespan, let's set that to 1000. Oop, not 103. There we go. And also, very importantly, on the Style tab, sorry, it's not the Style tab, the Controls tab, Rotation, untick the Always Face Camera, right? Because this will override anything we're doing in the pCustom in a moment, so we don't want that. And then finally, now we do go into the Style tab, set the style to bitmap, right? Animate over time right now doesn't matter because it's a single image. If you would work with an image sequence, you want to create different flowers and such, you can set it to particle birth time, but for now it doesn't really matter. Now we can pipe in our render into our emitter and show the P render, right? And now we see this bunch of particles. Now, not overly exciting, so the exciting bit will happen now. Hold on to your seats. We're going to add in the pCustom. There we go, pCustom. So the first thing we want to do is go into the interim tab. or intermediate tab even, where we can define a bunch of expressions and we can then reuse those in the particle tab. On the particle tab, we actually affect the movement, the position, and the color and such of the particle. But the interim tab, or the intermediate tab, is really handy to have things we will reuse. For instance, this one, ID -2. Now, what does that mean? ID is the identifier for each particle. So if you want to do something to a particle, you do it with the ID, or at least you can use the ID. So, but the weird thing about Fusion is that the particle numbering starts at 2, right? One word of caution, it's all a bit messed up if you change the subframe accuracy, but let's not go into that right now. But yeah, if we want to basically normalize the numbering, set it to say to start as of 0, we do ID -2. And as of then, I1, right, the short for intermediate 1, will be our identifier for each particle. So the next one up is the I2 function. So this is a function which we will use to create a singular ID for 6 particles. The 6 particles, the 6 petals that will constitute the flower. The reason we want to have that is that we want to have a singular position for each set of 6 particles, right? So that we can space them around. Now, how do we do that? Now, we use the floor function. A floor function basically rounds down a number to the nearest integer. So if you do, for instance, 1 divided by 3, and floor that, it will be 0. 2 divided by 3 would be 0. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 4 divided by 3 is 1. Until you get to 6, then it becomes 2, and so forth. So what we do here is floor, open brackets, and then I1. So that's the function we just defined here. So it's ID -2. So that starts at 0, goes up to 5, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. And divided by 6, and then 6, and then close brackets. So now the first 6 particles will have an I2 value of 0, the next 6 of 1, and so forth. Right? So this will be the one we'll use to position the particle. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, next one up. Now the fun really starts, I promise. So the position. So I do want to space these particles out. Now you would say, okay, well, you know, in the P emitter, I could have increased the region and such. But yeah, but we want to space the particles and group the petals together, as we just indicated. So how do we do that? You could start with basically a function here, but I want to make it conditional because I only want that position to be fixed at the very first frame number 1, or when the particle gets emitted, and that's h, the h of the particle is then 0. Right, so either way would work. But at that point, I want to fix the position, but then after that, I want it to just be whatever px would be, or py and pz, so that they can be affected by forces. Okay, so if, and that's with a single I in the pCustom tool, if h equals 0, then, and now it starts, our function rand s. So that's a random function which takes 3 parameters. Open brackets, the first one is the lowest value, so say -1, comma 1. So these are the sort of boundaries, so it will yield the result between -1 and 1. And then based on a random seed. Now the important thing here is it will always be the same random result depending on the seed you provide. So if you provide a seed of 5, no matter where you are, it will always produce the same sort of random result. It's not truly random, it's purely based on that seed. Right, now that seed, what we can do is use, and I hope you guessed that, I2. Right, so that means that all 6 petals belonging to the same I2 will get the same x position. So again, if the h is 0, so when the particle gets emitted, put that in a random position for each set. And if it is anything other than h equals 0, then have the original, or have the px. And now you see them distributed between -1 and 1. We want to do the same for the next one, but to save me typing, I'm copying it over. Now you get this diagonal line. Of course, we don't want that. First of all, of course, the px, we want to change to py. But of course you still have the diagonal, and that's because it will use yield the exact same random value between -1 and 1, because we've got the same random seed. So again, we still want to keep those I2 particles together, the sets of 6 together, but I don't want the Y position to be identical to the X, because that's basically what you get here, 0, 0, 1, 1, half, half. We don't want that. So let's create something else based on the same I2. For instance, I2 times 2. And now you've got it randomly distributed. We'll do the same thing for position Z. And then, of course, change Py into Pz and do I2 times 3. Now, nice. It seems to be a lot of work, but trust me, this works well. Now, what you can't see here right now is this seems to be a single triangle. In fact, there are 6, but they occupy the exact same X, Y, and Z position, right? So you don't see the difference here, but there are in fact 6. And that is what we'll use next, because next we're going to change the rotation. Once we've got a flower, so the 6 in a row or in a circle, we want that circle to go flap up and down, like sort of wings, I suppose. So the first thing, we've got here the x-axis, right? So the flapping, you can see as going around this x-axis. But we want that circle to be formed around the z-axis. Right, so let's do that first. Well, first let's set the x rotation to something where it lies flat, at least visually for us. So if we set this to 90, we see it's flat. Very important to understand here is that the rotation and in the pCustom is in degrees, not in radians. And that's a bit confusing because in some of the other tools and some of the other expressions, these type of rotations and sine and cosine functions are in radians. Here though, it's in degrees. Very, very important. Right? So later on, we'll move this about. But for now, say this is 90. Now, for the to make this circle of the 6 petals, right, we are going to use the rotation Y, right? But how do we do that? We're not going to use that I2, because then it will yield the same rotation for every single petal. Instead, we will use the original I1, right? So that equals the ID minus 2.
To 1,
and
0,
so for this
1
rotation then,
to 0.
We want 6 petals divided across 360 degrees. That constitutes a full circle. So 6 times 60 would be 360. So if we space them out by 60 degrees, we should basically get a circle. So let's try that. So I1 times 60. Wow, there we go. That works. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Now we were talking about this flapping, right? So I want this to go up and down. So if you do, for instance, a minus 45, you see they all go down. Plus 45, they all go up. Maybe a bit difficult to see. There's no light on in here. Still difficult to see. Let's quickly, before we go further, add in a merge 3D, and then we'll add in a couple of lights. So show that here, and we'll create a couple of point lights, and we'll use them later on anyways. So we'll pop one here, move that up, and copy it over, Ctrl C, Ctrl V, pop it there, and the next one will pop down. Okay, so now we've got a bit of a better feel of what's going on. Right, so back to the pCustom. Right, so we know now we can use this to move it up and down. Now, of course, we need to have movement. So how do we do this? Well, we can use the sine function. That's the period here, you see. And you can have that either expressed as degrees, from 0 to 180 to 360, or as radians, 0 to pi to 2 pi. As said though, in the pCustom, everything works in degrees, so let's stick to that. Right? There are ways to translate between radians and degrees and the other way around, but let's leave that for now. And we can see this, the axis here, as the time. Right? Of course, you can see it as an x as well as a position, but we see it as a time. So if we have a movement over time, we can see this movement going up, going down, going up again. That's what you see here. If you, however, want to amplify this, you can multiply the result. So you can see it here. You can multiply it. All right. But if you want this to move faster, right? So in these 360 frames, if we use time, right? If we want to do twice as many or twice as fast, you want to go, for instance, to go through it twice, you can do that. And you can, in fact, really make it as fast as you want, right? So this, and let's set it back to 1. This is the speed parameter. I call it the speed parameter. So it sort of will increase the speed of the period. All right, and then the last one is the offset. And the offset you can see here. Right, this is handy if we don't want all particles to move in an identical manner. You can just offset it. So you can use that by having the speed times, and then we've got time plus a certain offset. Right? So I hope that makes sense. If you do want to know more about it, there's lots of Google stuff out there and such. But let's head back to our composition here. So let's use what we just learned. So we've got our rotation X, and we've got, we want to basically alternate between minus 45 and 45. Now we know the sine goes from -1 to 1. So all we need to do is multiply that by 45. Okay, so we say 90, that's our base position, plus sine. And remember, we had the speed first. We don't want this to just flap up and down once in 360 frames. We want to do it faster. Say we want to do it 5 times. We can use 5 here, but what we can also do, which makes it much more flexible, use N1. N1 is a reference to the numbers tab. And in the numbers tab, you can then specify it. And later on, it makes it much easier to alter things. So I put this in as 4. So we now know this equals 4. So N1 times, open brackets, time. Right? Then it will all move up and down. So let's do that first, close brackets, and again. Right? Then we're close with the sine function times 45. Now what will happen now? Right? They will all go up and down. We've got our flapping. But as you can see, they all flap at exactly the same time because we don't have any offset. So as we saw in the function time plus an offset. So what we can use is just the I2 we already had. Right? So I2 was unique for each particle. Each set of particles. Right? So if you do I2, then we can see that there is in fact an offset. Right, and it looks pretty cool. And if you want the offset a bit different, you can do I2 times 2 or whatever. But as a base, this works fine. Right, so we're already halfway there. We've got our sort of particles or our flowers doing some cool flapping. All right, so next one up, I want to make them sort of rotate around as well, like a carousel of sorts. So again, we had our rotation, right, to put them around the flower. But if I want all of those petals then move in a clockwise way as well. So let's use this as the base. You can put it between brackets. It's not absolutely necessary, but I do it now. It makes it a bit easier to read. And then plus, for instance, times, we can even use the same N1, right? We had 4 there. So it will sort of revolve or go around as fast as it goes up and down. So you can see that now. Right, you see them going up and down. Of course, you can build in variation and such, but I think for now I'm pretty happy with this. Right, so the only other thing, well, not the only other thing, right? They stay stationary. So the Y position, in fact, everything, the P, X, Y, and Z remain the same. It's just the rotation that's changing. I want these to sort of go up and down. So what can we use? Well, we can use the Y velocity, right? And here we ran out of particle time 1000, so let's go back here. We can use the same sine function. So sine, open brackets, and then again we've got our speed in terms of how fast do we want to go. We want the period to be in terms of going up and down. Maybe we use the exact same N1. not needed. We can do something completely different, but for now, let's use the N1. And then again, do times, open brackets, time. And I don't want them all to move at the same time. So have an offset for each set of particles and a close bracket twice. If I now hit play, bang, what's happening? Well, it's moving way, way, way too fast. All right, so the amplitude we need to move down or decrease, say 0.05. I don't know actually. Let's try that. Still too fast, but it's better. 0.02. Still a bit too fast to my liking, so let's halve that again, 0.01. Yeah, that looks good, but I'm liking a bit of a slow movement, 0.05. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. So now we've got the Y moving, right? I also want them to move around a bit, to float, to let them float in space, right? You see it here, right? There's no X and Z movement, only a Y movement. So of course we can do that in here with all these expressions, but we can also use just a simple P turbulence. I'm sure you've done this before. P turbulence, right? And when we do this now, we see, and you see that a bit better from the top, right? They move around a bit, and maybe a bit much, right? So we can decrease, maybe 0.03, right? Almost like divide by 3. And this is, of course, to your own liking. This is a bit more subtle. Now, there's a really interesting thing here, and I want you to think about this, if possible. If we go to the conditions tab, what would happen if we would lower the probability? So what the probability is basically doing is saying, don't affect the particle that you're acting upon all the time, only affect it in, say, half of the cases. So one frame it would be affected, another frame it wouldn't be, in a sort of a random way, but the probability is halved. So on average, every other frame it would move. What would happen? Well, let's try that. And let's move back to the beginning. Let's play it now. Whoa, hold on. Our flowers are falling apart. Now, this is exactly what I meant earlier on. In our pCustom, right, we're moving everything in unison because we use that I2 to treat all particles in the same way, right? All the set of 6 particles we treat in the same way. So the X, Y, and Z are set to an identical position. The velocity Y is based on the same speed for each individual set. But if we now go to the P turbulence, which has got no notion of our set of 6 together, and if we load the probability, right, if you have a probability of 1, basically it will look at the position of a particle, and based on the position, right, say this position is 1,2,1, whatever, it will act upon it. But the position of these 6 is identical, so it will move in an identical manner. But if you say, well, you know, and make it lower, then at this frame they're identical, well, at the start, but when then you start moving around, some particles will get affected because of this probability, but not all. Say at this frame, this and this particle will, or these 2 particles will get affected, but the next frame maybe these. And then the force may be just a bit different considering where they are. And that's why they will fall apart. So important thing here is to keep the probability at 1. Right, and now we've got a pretty cool animation. We're not quite done yet. I want the colors to be a bit more interesting than just white. So back to the pCustom. Of course, we can put in the P emitter, we can put in some random color variation, but I want to keep these petals all the same color for each flower. So again, we can use a similar thing here. Say we want to have the green always at 0.5. The blue maybe always at 0.5, right? Just as an example. And let's vary the red, right? And we do the same thing, rand as. I want to vary it between maybe 0.5, the red channel, and 1, based on you may have guessed it, I2. So each petal or each flower will be treated in the same way. And now you see this slight variation, right, for each flower. Maybe not an awful lot, but there is definitely variation in there. Maybe not enough. Say we want to do the same thing for the blue channel. Also vary that between 0.5 and 1, but let's use a bit of a different seed, I2 times 2. Right, and now we've got some more bluish particles, pinky, orangey. So we've got a nice sort of, there's still some consistency, but you've got some variation as well. So that's what I wanted to have. Of course, you can have a totally different approach. One more thing, it is nice if these colors will fluctuate over time. Right, so what you could do, say this will yield something between 0.5 and 1, right? And let's maybe say add a variable in there. So what can we do here? We can, for instance, use the sine function again, but the sine function will go from -1 to 1. I don't want that. I don't want negative color values. So what I will do is say plus, and then ABS, which means absolute. I take the absolute of the sine function, right? Make it dependent on time, and we can use the same speed here, the n1 times time, or open brackets time. We can use an offset if we want, and let's do that. I2, close brackets, and then close again for the absolute value. And then basically this will alternate between 0 and 1. And we already had 0.5 and 1. And then we get an overabundance really of red. So we can do maybe times 0.5. Right? And now if we play this, right, you see some movement of the red channel in unison with the movement of the flowers. Now, may still be a bit too much, right? But maybe we do 0.3. Right, but you know, play around with this. That's you can of course change the green channel and such, you know, whatever you like. The more you understand, the more flexibility you have, and that's very important with the pCustom tool. Right, so for now I think we're done with this particle system. Now of course we want to prettify it a bit. So one of the things I want to do is put a little sphere in the middle, right? That can be sort of the core of the flower. I'm not using the right terminology here, but in any case, right? The easy way to do this, I want them, that core of course, to have the exact same movement as the petals. But I can't use the same particle system because these are fed by these triangles. So I want to have an actual 3D sphere in the middle. So what I can do is just copy this, Control C, and then paste instance, right? This will ensure it will have an identical type of treatment. So the movement will be all the same. We can feed it in here in a moment, and I'll do so, but not right now. We need to make a few changes. First of all, this is set to bitmap, right, as this one is, and you could feed it with this, but I want that to change first. So go to the Style tab, and very important, de-instance this first. Otherwise, when you change it here, it will change it in the original as well. So let's set this just purely from a visual perspective to blob. And let's now feed it in here. And we see this blob, right? Now, this, of course, doesn't look good yet. So we need to change a few more things. Let's head over to the pCustom. For the sphere, really, some of these rotations are not really needed, right? So we don't need to go up and down and such in terms of rotation X. Right, so what we can do again here, de-instance this, right, and just say here Rx, right, the original, or you can set it to 0, doesn't really matter. Rotation Y doesn't really matter, won't affect things, but we can also get rid of that. De-instance and make that Ry. Okay, and again, you need to de-instance this, otherwise these would be affected. Okay, so we're there for this. So the only thing is, you can't see it, but you will have for each sphere, you will actually have 6, or for each particle there are actually 6 at that position. Not so much of an issue, but I think that's a bit of an overkill. Again, another intended pun. So let's de-instance the kill parameter. So this kills off a particle if the result is 1 or larger. So what I can do here is basically say if, and we use the particle ID, but -2, so we use the I1 modulus 6 equals 0, then kill it, keep it, so 0, otherwise kill it. So what does this really do? Well, this modulus function, or is it modulo or modulus? I can't recall. In any case, that's sort of the remainder after division. So if you say have 1 modulo 6, then the result is 1. For 2 modulo 6 is 2, 3, 4, 5. It's all 2, 3, 4, 5 and such. When you get to 6 divided by 6, there's no remainder, right? So it yields 0. The same will go for 12. 12 divided by 6 is 2, and there's no remainder. And that's basically what it does. So every 6 particles will equal 0. So basically, if every 6 it will equal 0, keep that one, but kill off the rest. So this will kill 5 of the 6 particles. I hope that made sense. So you won't visually notice the difference here, but otherwise you'll basically get particles you don't need. Now what we now need to do is replicate 3D, and we feed that with a shape 3D. Pop that in there, change the shape from plane to sphere. Bang, way too large, right? But we can then change the scale to something like maybe 0.05. That's maybe too small. There we go. Okay, so now each flower has got a sphere. And it takes the same, well actually right now, it combines the particle color and the color of the shape. Let's set it completely to particle color. And then it will look identical, but say if we want to have that a bit more yellow for all of them. So go to the pCustom and let's de-instance these color channels. De-instance, right? So, and say we set the green to, well, 0.5 or maybe say 1 and the blue to 0. And now we get this one that goes from a bit greeny to yellow. Maybe a bit too green, say. Now it will be alternating between this sort of orange and yellow type value, or orange and red. In any case, right, you still have that fluctuation, but you have got sort of a more of a base color for each petal. Okay, so that is really cool. So let's now go to the next step. Let's get a camera in here. Right, so let's find first a nice position for our camera. Let's say here, and then we add a camera 3D. Oh, where's that? Here. Pipe it in here, and what you can do then is right click here and copy point of view to camera 3D. And now the camera 3D will have this exact position. I use this technique all the time. Now we've got a camera, we can add in a renderer. And let's show that. Cool. Let's set that to OpenGL. Let's enable lighting. And also for now, I'll remove the checker underlay. So we've got moving flowers. Pretty cool. And of course now you can do things like add a soft glow. And let's do actually 2 soft glows. Let's focus the first one on more low gain, low glow size. Very low. Maybe something like this. And then another soft glow, which is a bit more subtle. A lot less gain, but a lot more glow. Maybe something like this. Right, but you know, of course, tastes may vary as they do. Okay, so we're not quite there yet, right? In the example you saw, we had a sort of a ground plane and such, but I also want to have a bit of depth of field and I want to have some camera movement. So let's work on that first. So let's show the merge 3D here and here actually. So in the perspective view, we see the camera and say we want to have the focus point somewhere around the middle. So the first thing we want to do is go to the visibility and tick focal plane, right? And then we can move this around and say we set it to something like this. So this will be the focus point. If we then go to the render in 3D and then switch on the accumulation effects, enable them. First of all, I want to increase the quality. And of course, for the final render, you can set it a lot higher, but of course the amount of blur I want to be substantially lower. Don't want to go over the top. So here you've got a more subtle type of depth of field. Cool. Right? It of course is now a lot slower. So if you play around a lot, you know, in the meantime, just disable it. And especially when you work on the animation, you don't have to show the renderer. So let's do that. And let's, you know, revolve this camera around this. Now an easy way to do this, rather than animating an awful lot, because I'm a bit lazy, just a bit, transform 3D, right? Pop that in the middle. And if you now do this, right, you see it's revolving around the cloud of particles. So if we want to move to the right, you see this going to the right. So what we do, of course, we add in a little expression. Very simple, time. Okay, so if we now show this as the camera, so this is the resulting movement. So you got a lot more of, well, camera movement, obviously. Right, so all looking great. Ground plane, right? Let's do that. Let's add in a shape, 3D, as always. Pop it in here. Let's move this around a bit on the x-axis to light flat and scale it up maybe to 15, right? Very, 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 very large. I want to have some subdivisions, but not too many, because I like to have quite an abstract type of sort of mountainous plain area. So now I add a displace 3D. You guys may have done this before, I suspect. And let's add then in a fast noise piping into this, and let's display it. Let's pop on the lights. Now this doesn't look terribly exciting yet, I do concur. Let's add a bit of contrast. It already looks a bit better. Let's go into the shape 3D and let's show the wireframe momentarily. Right, so I actually a bit more contrasty, maybe lower it a bit like this. Let's switch this off. We'll fix that later. Once we work with this, we'll use some ambient occlusion and such, and it will look pretty cool. For now, just for positioning purposes, pipe it into the Merge 3D. And of course, this looks a bit ludicrous, right? Because this is way too close to the particles. So you see they're moving through here. So let's lower the whole thing a bit. So after the displace 3D, let's add a transform 3D and lower the y-axis. Right, so now, and in fact, I think maybe there was a bit too much contrast, maybe something like this. Right, so now we've got something better. And if we display this, we've got a ground plane. Now let's give that a bit of a color. But before we do that, let's actually, instead of changing the color here, let's add a background node, and I'll explain why later. And let's set that to maybe dark blue and feed it in there. Again, you could have done that here as well, but I'm going to change something here later on, so that's why I'm feeding in a background plane rather than changing the material here. I can still set the specular a bit different, right? Intensity, I can lower that and such. So that still works, but let's not worry too much about it right now. So the first thing though I want to do is, if you put this now in the renderer, or sorry, if you display the renderer here, sorry, it was a bit slow. Everything is glowing in, oh sorry, if you put in the glow, it also affects the ground plane. I want that to be treated differently, right? So for that reason, I'm going to put in a separate renderer for our ground. So what I can do is basically add in a separate merge node, and instead of piping it in here, I pipe it directly to the merge node. Now, of course, I want to have the exact same camera movement there, so I'll take the output with the transform and also put it in this merge 3D. And I also want to have the lights, it's getting a bit messy, because I want the lights to affect the ground plane as well. So now we've got a separate merge, right? But let's pipe in then a renderer 3D and display that here, right? We want to set this to OpenGL and we want to enable the lighting. Okay, so doesn't look brilliant yet. And you can do an awful lot, but I'm using a bit of a trick here. I'm going to use an ambient occlusion node and display that. You of course first get an error message, right? The node is in red. That is because of three things. First of all, it needs to have a scene camera. So you can just take the output of the merge 3D and pipe it in here. Next one up, it needs to have some channels enabled. It needs to have a Z channel or Z channel and a normal channel. And now you can see something happening. It's all white. But if we now bring down the kernel radius, see, and bring the lift down, gamma down, right, now you see already a pretty nice effect. And if we set this now to color, you get this effect. So let's tweak it a bit, bring it down further. Maybe like this, but also whilst I'm here in the fast noise, I want to scale it up a tiny bit so that I've got a bit more variety. And then we need to go back to the ambient occlusion as well. It's getting a bit too dark here now. Yeah, this is looking pretty good, right? So now we can then merge our particles on top of this, and then we get something like this. Right, so that is looking pretty cool. Now, another thing I want to do, I had it in the example as well, I want this to have a bit of an underwater feel. Now, a way to do this, and that's why I created this separate background node, is to create a fast noise. Right, display that here, increase the scale a bit, maybe to something like this, discontinuous, inverted. And if we now pipe this into here and merge that, it's getting very light, so we may need to alter the brightness somewhat. And maybe scale it up a bit further. Contrast. You do need to play around with it a bit. I think we need to scale it up maybe to 40. Right, brightness down. Not quite what I had in mind. Let's play around with the apply mode. Maybe more something like this. And then blend it a bit so there's a bit less prominent. And now the key is, right, if we merge that here and show that here as well, we add some movement into it. So if we set a seed rate of say something like 0 to 15, you see this happening. And this will then result in these sort of caustic patterns moving around here. Maybe a bit hard to see, maybe let it cache a bit. Yeah, you see it happening a bit. But in any case, experiment with that. We can also blur out this a bit. We didn't actually enable accumulation effects. You can do that, of course, right, in a very similar way, right? So there's one last thing we can do, or at least I'll show you briefly, and that is to add some of these spawned particles, right? So if we go back to the start, and we saw that in the video, it's sort of spawning off these little dots. So I'll just quickly show you, and then I'll show you one other concept before we're done. So in the p-emitter, the original p-emitter, let's set this to set 1, and let's ensure that in the pCustom, in the conditions tab, it's affecting specific sets. So now it's affecting all sets, but let's untick set 2. Doesn't make any difference right now, but what I want to do is spawn off particles and assign them to set 2, and those particles will then not be affected by this pCustom. Right? So I'll briefly do that, quickly even. Set the number to 1, and then in the style tab, yeah, point, we can use that, or we can use blob, but then use a fairly small size, maybe 0.01. Let's see what this looks like now, right? And actually, let's not show the final render, let's show this 3D view, right? And then you see this happening. Now, this is all a bit much for me. Right, so in the control tab, first of all, the lifespan, let's make this a lot shorter, maybe something like 10, 10, and a tiny bit of variation, maybe 3. And let's also change the probability a bit, make it a bit lower. Yeah, one of the issues is, you see them there, but it's really following the movement, right? So that's because in the velocity tab, it's basically transferring the velocity of this particle that's initiating the spawn. So if we set this to 0 and then hit, right, then it's more trailing behind. Of course, because of the depth of field, not everything will be showing as clearly, but here we see the particles. But play around with it, right? That's the that's the main thing. I think we're really nearly done. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to tell you guys? Oh yeah, right at the end, of course. You do want to attach this to the media out for it to appear on the edit tab. Of course, you can also render it here with a render or with a saver node. One more thing, let's have a look here. I've got here a media in, right? That's just a little leaf. Again, I did the same thing here. It's 200 by 200, and I ensured that the pivot point would be around here. And then instead of having your n-gon here and such, pipe this in here. And there we go. We all of a sudden have this particle system based on actual leaves. So you can, go wild with that. You can have vastly different leaves. You can even have different flowers, but that's for another time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.